I am Ernesto de la Cruz, the greatest musician of all time.
Fame is a mask that eats the face. This quotation is from the legendary American poet and writer John Updike, and it could not be more befitting here. Similar to Hector in Coco, John Updike's eminence comes nowhere near his actual genius. So let's get into what he said. Everyone loves a good hero, someone who has led a legendary life and inspires others to do the same. Ernesto seems to be that hero. He's inspired all of Mexico with his music and had a legendary career without any tragedies, right? Well, not really. In the movie, our celebrated and charismatic villain is hiding something very dark in his past. But we can't figure that out from the very get-go. Despite there being hints about De La Cruz's true nature throughout the film, up until the point that the curtains drop on him, Ernesto appears to be a sincere seeker and patron of the arts. The truth about how he did it, however, is not as pretty as his hair.
Success doesn't come for free, Miguel. You have to be willing to do whatever it takes to seize your moment.
For Ernesto, status has its price, and he did seize his moment and get what he wanted, but perhaps not in the context that he would have hoped, which made Ernesto notorious as being one of the most perfectly written twist villains in all of animated cinema. How did Pixar meticulously craft him every step of the way to make sure he became the beloved villain we know today? Well, it all starts in the setting where the story takes place. Coco takes place on the night of the traditional Mexican holiday Dia de los Muertos, also known as the Day of the Dead. The festival highlights the importance of loving and revering one's ancestors and demonstrates the significance of strong familial bonds. On this day, all of the people place photographs of their ancestors all the way back to the beginning of their family tree, on an altar or ofrenda. They then decorate their houses with candles and lay out sugar skulls, tamales, and other treats for their deceased loved ones. A dense trail of marigold petals is laid out at the base of the ofrenda and extends all the way to the entrance of the homes. This trail is believed to serve as a pathway to welcome the spirits back home. The reason this festival holds such significance is because of the belief that the deceased can be kept alive through memory. The setting ties strongly into the phenomena of celebrity and popularity, which increase reverence and remembrance for a person long after they have passed. Essentially, the film highlights the weight of love against worldly popularity while exploring the subject of authenticity. This setting lays the perfect backdrop for Ernesto to carry out his charade. At the start of the movie, Miguel, a young boy from the Rivera family, expresses his innate desire to become a musician against the wishes of his family. We can empathize with this emphatic belief that his suppression and lack of pursuit of his dream is a betrayal towards his true nature. There is betrayal at play, for sure, but not the kind that you might think. Miguel's family opposes his wish when they learn about it. This is because they have spent several generations believing that Miguel's great-great-grandfather left his wife and infant daughter for a musical career. The legacy of valuing family traditions above music has been determinately passed down. So staunch is the Rivera family's disdain towards music, in fact, that the identity of Miguel's great-great-grandfather remains hidden up until the end of the film. Ernesto de la Cruz has been hurting people and breaking apart families long before his death. But during the duration of Coco, the reason that he is able to continue in his efforts at harming people is because the Rivera family has kept a secret. The distance could have brought doom upon the Rivera family through the loss of Miguel in his childhood. Some people actually believe that this did, in fact, happen, and Disney tried to cover it up to make the movie palatable for children. Let me know your opinions about this in the comments. And the only person who knows the truth is Mama Coco, Miguel's great-great-grandmother, who is losing her memory due to old age. Something happened in his early childhood. Misfortune started here, but nobody is ready to come face-to-face with the truth. But what role did Ernesto play in the misfortune that fell upon his family? The origins of Ernesto de la Cruz are not revealed until the later half of the film, when the plot twist happens. Up until that point, he is showcased as a celebrated musician and actor whose fame and popularity have not been impeded by his death.
Ernesto de la Cruz, the greatest musician of all time.
He is depicted as a masterful poet whose words moved the hearts of people and empowered them to live their lives to the full potential. Other than his infamous line, "Seize your moment," playbacks of Ernesto's film scenes occur throughout the film. Nobody knows where he came from, only that in the mid-20s, Ernesto managed to write and perform some of the most beautiful songs that all of Mexico had ever heard. In true twist villain fashion, the origin story of Ernesto de la Cruz is actually the plot twist of the film. Despite his self-satisfied outward appearance, Ernesto is actually quite insecure from within. But what would someone so celebrated and revered need to be insecure about? For that, we have to look at his rise to fame. Ernesto wasn't always the beloved solo artist as we've known him for the first half of the show. Instead of going solo, he set off with his friend Hector to perform music. The duo was made up of two components. Ernesto provided grandiosity, good looks, and exhibitionism, all characteristics of a good stage setting, and Hector provided the music, the poetry, the lyrics, and the songs.
The greatest musician of all time.
Maybe, but his music? Not so much.
However, the duo was doomed from the beginning. It wasn't going to last forever. At one point, during their travels, Hector started getting homesick. He realized that he shouldn't have abandoned his family for music and that he needed to go back to them. After all, he didn't even feel as though music was his destined career path. It was more of something that he enjoyed. It was Ernesto who has been one to talk Hector into pursuing this path, and Ernesto wasn't going to let Hector leave. In the flashback scene, when Hector tries to leave, we catch sight of Ernesto's expressions twisting, from pleading to anger, and then back again to his welcoming old self. It's the mask I mentioned before. Ernesto de la Cruz is such a perfect psychotic twist villain because his intention was to take what was not his. I think he could have just gotten a career counselor involved and figured out a way to become rich and famous without being evil. A deep dive into his motives should help us understand why he was the way that he was. Ernesto clearly sought success, but what else was going on in that head full of hair of his? In my opinion, his motives become clear from the first time that we actually see him in the film. The reason Ernesto manages to fool us all for the first 100 minutes of the movie is because he continues to make indirect appearances, depriving his audience of a straightforward observation of who he is, and the elements of deception that are at play here, and it's still not quite perceptible. It is only after he spins around and looks at Miguel, an aspiring musician who believes himself to be Ernesto's great-great-grandson, and in the self-promoting sequence that follows, that we first see Ernesto in the flesh and become aware of his inflated sense of self. It's glaringly obvious from the first appearance that everything from Ernesto's sharp suit to his snooty mustache is the vision of self-importance and superiority. It's also that, despite being a self-proclaimed lover of music, he does not turn around and listen to Miguel's song until he absolutely has to. When Miguel takes up the guitar and starts playing in order to gain his great-great-grandfather's attention, the entire crowd falls silent. They are bewitched by the music. As Miguel paves his path towards the villain by parting a sea of people as he strums his guitar, Ernesto is gossiping with guests, clearly reflective of how his true talent lies in words and manipulation, rather than in love for music. When we observe this scene closer, we see that he doesn't actually turn around until the guest's attention wavers from him. Ernesto only looks at Miguel to find out why he's not the center of attention anymore, and he quickly regains his station in the spotlight by making an elaborate display of jumping into the swimming pool to pick up Miguel, who has fallen inside. Even in this instance, Ernesto maintains a certain distance from Miguel. He's standing at least 2 feet away from the child, signifying a lack of concern. His instinctive reaction to Miguel's hug is also that of surprise rather than of joy. We've already watched Miguel tell Ernesto that he is his great-great-grandson, so a feeling of shock at Miguel closing the distance doesn't exactly make sense. It's also that in the entrance scene, Ernesto rescues Miguel but leaves the boy's guitar in the pool. This is a small hint towards Ernesto's lack of concern towards music that is about to unfold within the next few minutes. It's a small crack in the surface that will grow to unveil him as the ultimate twist villain that he is. But before all of this grandiosity and the eminence associated with De La Cruz that is at display since the start of the movie, who was Ernesto de la Cruz? We learn that he left his hometown in order to make his mark on the world. But what actually drove that desire? So it's elaborately clear that Ernesto is an egomaniacal villain who's jealous of his talented friend Hector. We can also clearly see that Ernesto craves validation, admiration, a sense of superiority, and control over his environment, and feels deserving of special treatment. But all of this stems from fragile self-esteem. Ernesto doesn't capitalize on the cards that he has been dealt. Charisma, charisma and good looks. He rather steals from another. He also doesn't embark on his mission to gain fame and recognition alone. Rather, he drags Hector alongside him. This desire to dominate social settings and maintain an inflated sense of self continues long into his death. But those are just the obvious parts. Ernesto de la Cruz is such a good twist villain because his evil is just as significant when observed independent of the plot. If Ernesto were in any other movie, he would be just as sinister, but in this particular storyline, the impact of his actions is amplified. This is because Coco dives into the afterworld and how spirits can remain alive, or avoid the final death, by being forgotten. And because this belief is an inherent part of Mexican culture, I can't help but think that this was part of his plan all along. By amassing recognition and making a false place in the hearts of people through stolen music, Ernesto is able to stay alive in the afterworld, whereas the original singer and songwriter, Hector, runs the risk of the final death, which happens when one is forgotten in the mortal world. And what makes matters worse is that even after decades of this, Ernesto is unwilling to let anything sabotage whatever he has. No, Ernesto would go on to hanker after the upkeep of his celebrity status, even as a skeleton, because he wants to stay alive forever. This becomes apparent when we see that Ernesto doesn't go back to the mortal world and take the offerings of his fans on the one night of the year that he is granted passage. Instead, he throws a Gatsby-style party in his penthouse in the afterworld and is later scheduled for a concert until sunrise, missing the chance to visit the mortal world entirely. This seems to highlight the fact that Ernesto doesn't have a loved one to visit, only fans whose gifts he can collect, and the fact he doesn't have a family almost makes us feel sorry for him. Almost, I said. Not quite. So, given the fact that Ernesto didn't have a family and instead sought fame and fortune to preserve immortality, can we make a tiny bit of room for forgiveness of this self-absorbed murderer and charlatan? We would, but he doesn't want to stop being a self-absorbed murderer and charlatan.
Miguel, your great-great-grandson.
Let's first examine the family part. When Miguel shows up at Ernesto's penthouse and claims to be his great-great-grandson, Ernesto's response is weird. Rather than spilling tears of joy and relief at having a family line, he instead makes the whole thing all about himself. We can see this in the sequence that immediately follows, where Ernesto starts telling people that he has a great-great-grandson and praises himself, not once looking at Miguel.
Have you met my great-great-grandson? My great-great-grandson! He's alive and a musician to boot. You know, I did all my own stunts.
Though I have to say goodbye, remember me.
Ernesto doesn't care about having a family. The man can't even stop looking at himself. But that's not all. Ernesto only cares about grandiosity and show, and he's willing to murder Hector, his friend, a second time in the afterworld in order to maintain this status. That's not all. Ernesto is also prepared to take down a child. If that's not a force of pure evil, I don't know what is. So, was Ernesto ever going to be anything different from who he was? I don't think so, and neither does Ernesto.
One cannot deny who one is meant to be.
In the scene where Ernesto is revealed to be evil, he raises a toast to Hector, which the man gulps down, and we watch the camera focus on Ernesto's face, which is now brimming with anticipation. Shortly thereafter, Hector passes away. Ernesto seizes Hector's diary of poetry and performs all of those songs as his own. I think that Ernesto's obscene desire for fame and recognition stemmed from an inner feeling of worthlessness. He developed and posed a facade for which he went to ruthless extents because he was so scared of passing away without having left a mark on this world. It's terribly sad, but I mean, Ernesto is a deranged egomaniac. Buddy, you already had a charismatic personality, and you're clearly a natural at fooling people. So why didn't you let Hector go off on his way and just become an actor? Why did you have to rub someone out and claim what wasn't yours? We do see later on that Ernesto did also become a famous actor and used the scene in which he murdered his friend as a part of the script in the film. In my opinion, Ernesto de la Cruz is an archetypal narcissist. Not only do we continuously watch him live for the applause, attempt to maintain control and domination, and seek admiration and validation, he also has a shocking lack of accountability. We see this when Imelda Rivera whacks him with a shoe.
That's for murdering the love of my life!
Ernesto does not apologize, of course. We expected that. But he doesn't get angry either. One would think that a psychotic murderer like him would believe that he was entitled to show his wrath in response. But Ernesto just runs away. He's a coward behind all that pompousness. He's scared. He knows that he has committed a terrible crime and he's not even going to own up to it. Ernesto's narcissism is also evident from his coldness and lack of emotion, which is evident throughout the film. This becomes especially true when we place him in comparison to Hector, who is always warm and caring towards Miguel despite not knowing his true identity. Ernesto, on the other hand, couldn't keep him further away even when he believed him to be his grandson. Ernesto isolates Hector from his family during life and then gaslights him when Hector first suspects that it was him who murdered him.
You're confusing movies with reality, Hector.
The absence of empathy, which hints at Ernesto's narcissistic nature, is further elaborated in a dialogue before Ernesto is about to give Miguel his blessing to go back to the land of the living.
I hope you die very soon.
I mean, who says that? To a boy, even if you loved his company, which you didn't because you were too busy showing off yourself, why would you say something like that to a child? Ernesto's cold and calculating narcissism makes him the perfect twist villain because a narcissist will always pretend to be the good guy in order to gain applause. Narcissists go to elaborate lengths in order to prevent their false persona from being shattered and are known to destroy their victim's reputation and credibility in order to prevent this occurrence. Ernesto, on the other hand, is ready to murder in cold blood. He's not prepared to meet his defeat.
Miguel, my reputation, it is very important to me.
By tarnishing Hector's reputation in the afterworld as someone who choked on a morsel of food to meet his own death, Ernesto has delayed Hector's discovery of the truth. He has also made sure that even if he found out, no one would believe him, but people would find out. Ernesto de la Cruz meets his demise when the curtains of his deceit drop in front of the whole world. In one of the final scenes in the afterworld, he tries to steal Hector's photograph so that it cannot be placed on an ofrenda lest Hector be welcomed back into the world. But as he issues this threat to the dying Hector and admits to having murdered him, the ancestors of the Rivera family broadcast his true face to the whole world. When Ernesto reappears on stage, believing he has successfully silenced Hector and the Rivera family, we watch the crowd boo at him. He loses validation and applause. The orchestra players then refuse to perform alongside him. He no longer has control. Theoretically, this would be enough to end a narcissist right there and then, because the preservation of their facade is their ultimate goal and mission in life. But it gets better. Miguel is able to inform the mortal world about the true author of the songs, and Ernesto is dethroned. Because of this, he's ultimately forgotten, and in Coco, when you are forgotten, you meet the ultimate death. We still remember Ernesto de la Cruz, of course, but as Pixar's ultimate twist villain rather than a hero, we would like to learn from his example to see how we, too, can write a menacingly evil narcissist who will leave no stone unturned in his journey of self-appraisal. The character design plays a key role in Ernesto's depiction as a twist villain. He's a broad-shouldered man with a symmetrical facial structure, high cheekbones, and poofed-up hair. Other than his charming smile, Ernesto wears a stylish white suit with gold accents. These colors are used to signify purity, wealth, and success. From the outset, Ernesto is an idol for any aspiring musician or performer. He continues to maintain this glamorous image of success as he moves Miguel to pursue his dream of becoming a musician. In fact, up until the minute that we enter his elaborate penthouse, Ernesto is the very vision of refinement, authenticity, and opulence. Even inside his home, Ernesto is showcased in the warm-hued lighting of his old films, the scenes of which are displayed on the walls. Although this is a clue towards his self-absorption, it does not give him away completely. Not yet. Rather, at this point, the colorism of the films continues to depict Ernesto as a heroic superstar who has managed to win the hearts of people. The dialogues that Ernesto speaks within these films are all about encouraging others to be motivated to live fearlessly and from the heart. It is only when we see Ernesto in the flesh that the first crack appears in the pristine surface that he has built for himself. Ernesto in the flesh is displayed in cooler and darker lights. This hints towards his detached and manipulative nature. Later in the scene, when Ernesto finally reveals his true nature, he is enveloped in almost complete darkness. This colorism lighting continues for the rest of the scenes in which Ernesto appears. We can recognize the dark hollowness within, and at this point, the flashy suit cannot contain it. Rather, it makes his falseness glaringly obvious, and the absence of anything striking appearance-wise, such as the patternless white suit used for Ernesto, only serves to help us realize that with this character, Pixar wants us to focus more on his nature and actions than his outward appearance. The white suit also accents his facial features, which in the flashback scene always have a distinctive smugness to them. Ernesto de la Cruz is a twist villain whose true nature is subtly pointed towards throughout the first half of the movie. However, due to the smoke and mirrors that this character has created, we watch Miguel become absorbed by his own dream and ignore the continuous clues. The absence of communication among characters, such as between Hector and his wife and daughter, as well as Miguel with his family, strengthens the potential of Ernesto's attack. It doesn't, however, absolve him of responsibility or change his core nature. The truth is that with a villain like Ernesto on the scene, doom is bound to ensue. So how do we write a twist villain of such an elaborate nature that he would be villainous regardless of the setting in which he is planted? This requires a blend of personality traits that make Ernesto de la Cruz who he is. And by learning these elements, you too can write a twist villain that compares to Disney's De La Cruz. Ernesto de la Cruz is a self-centered, emotionalist megalomaniac. His outwardly pristine appearance serves only to showcase his inner hollowness. I think that Pixar developed this character through a mix of self-promotion, kleptomania, low self-worth, and ruthlessness. A combination of these characteristics makes for a truly loathful villain. Let's dive into how you can write someone similar in a step-by-step manner. Ernesto de la Cruz's grandiosity is demonstrated from his very first appearance within the film. He's introduced as the greatest musician of all time, a statement that he later affirms. This is a tall claim to make, and one that a true musician would be wary of making. Rather, a real artist would always believe in the inherent imperfection of their art. This is because they would have been in the trenches doing the work and would therefore be aware of the complexities of the process of bringing their work into light, rather than beaming smugly at the apparent perfection of the finished product. The phenomenon of exaggerated claims being directly proportional to a lack of substance and expertise on the subject is known as the Dunning-Krueger effect, the result of a study which shows that the more someone knows about a subject, the less likely they are to boast about it. Because the more you learn about the intricacies of a subject or process, the more you realize that there is yet more to learn. Nobody can have complete mastery over anything, and only a poser would claim otherwise. Planting the Dunning-Krueger effect so early on in the film and making it central to Ernesto's character was an early clue into his true nature and a clever depiction of how he is actually a charlatan. It was, however, heavily concealed by the current storyline. Making a twist villain aloof, mysterious, and inaccessible is a great way to keep up their charade. This is because the distance between the character's persona and their actual self leaves room for the audience, and even other characters, to draw conclusions that benefit the villain.
First steps toward becoming the most beloved singer in Mexican history.
For this reason, Miguel is able to position Ernesto as a guiding force within his life throughout the first 100 minutes in the film. It is also this very mystery about Ernesto's roots that allows him to lose himself as a talented poet and musician and rise to fame. The gap created in such a setting also allows the twist, or the moment of awakening, to become a lot more impactful. By not knowing anything much about Ernesto, except that he's pretty self-obsessed, learning about Hector's murder shocked all of us.
I would move heaven and earth for you, mi amigo. Salud!
This aloofness also prevented us from forming positive perceptions about Ernesto that might have left room for forgiveness. His inability to deign to turn towards a young boy running towards him painted him in a cold and unfeeling light. Ernesto also doesn't bother to give the guests at his party a warm welcome. He is heavily concealed behind guards and sycophants. We also cannot hear Ernesto's direct conversation with the guests at the party in the scene where we see him in the flesh. This further prevents us from forming perceptions about him and instead allows us to focus more on his actions in order to learn that he is, in fact, a villain. Ernesto doesn't think highly of himself. If he did, he would have capitalized on his own talents rather than murdering his best friend and stealing his work. His low self-esteem is made further apparent by his cowardice towards those who know the truth about him. Wedging a divide between the villain's perception and presentation of self is a great way to write a twist villain because this ultimately sets the stage for the grand reveal, both when they are showcased as a villain as well as when everyone finds out. This conflict also helps tie in motive and irredeemable action, such as a thirst for recognition and applause, and murdering someone in order to acquire these things. Tying these actions into writing the character is important because this gets rid of any and all empathy or pity that we, the audience, might feel towards such a villain. Ernesto de la Cruz's narcissism is key to this twist villain. Giving a bad guy narcissism is an excellent way to make them a twist villain. This also makes it easier for us to develop their motivation and actions. But a bad guy with narcissism will ultimately have a split between what they pose to be and who they truly are. It makes creating two faces and the facade a whole lot easier. Making Ernesto a narcissist was a great way to create a compelling backstory and depict his ruthless pursuit of power and recognition. In Coco, the cracks in Ernesto's facade begin to appear early on. It's just that we can't see them as clearly because of the strength of the facade. In my opinion, the first crack appears with the grandiosity of De La Cruz's self-appraisal. The second one, when Hector seems not to like him.
De La Cruz's blessing!
That's weirdly specific.
He's my great-great-grandfather!
He's your what?
The third one, when Hector says he's not a good musician, and the fifth ill omen about Ernesto is that Imelda and even Dante are stopping Miguel from going to his party. These were all supposed to foreshadow the truth of who Ernesto really is, and were actually subtle unconscious cues that made the truth about him all the more believable, despite his gaslighting, for both Miguel as well as us, the audience. Pixar's Ernesto de la Cruz is a two-faced trickster, the proportions of which are only as magnanimous as his hair, but he's ultimately just a spineless guy who inflates himself to appear bigger. And as you can see, he's not all that he appears to be. In fact, by following the guidelines that I've laid out, you can easily write someone like him in your own fictional story of deceit, deception, and betrayal. If you like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to your comments about how shocked you were at finding out what Ernesto was really like. In the meantime, let's hope that remembering him doesn't extend his afterlife.